All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know it's a couple of minutes beforehand, but thank you for all of you for attending today's International Leadership Series. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Dr. Nicholas Hudson, and I serve as the Director of the Office of Student Orientation, Leadership and Engagement, and I host the International Leadership Series along with International Experiences here at TAMU. And we've been hosting these series as one of our longest running leadership programs here at the institution. And so we have a theme every year, and our theme for this year is globalization and interdependence. And we'll talk a little bit more about what does that look like as we move through here. But we really focus on the different elements of being a global citizen, right? So what are our hopes as an institution when you graduate and walk across that stage? This is what we hope you ultimately are able to do as you enter into. So for those of you who are here or this is your first time attending, we also have a program entitled International Leadership Series, or excuse me, International Leadership Fellow, of which you have to attend 5 of these programs throughout the year. There's a total of 6, and you have to participate in the Art for Social Change competition in April of 2025, and you're awarded a medal. It's one of the more prestigious awards that we have for student leaders here on campus. And for those who are interested, there is a QR code for you to still sign up. We still take signups throughout this year. So if you plan on doing and attending these on a frequent basis, because we always serve some wonderful food and have some great thought process. Our next one is going to be in November, and it's going to feature international student experiences here in the United States prior to them going back to their home country. You can do that there. So this is a learning opportunity, and our hope is that when you attend today, you learn a little bit about globalization and interdependence. And so we define globalization as the economic, social, and political integration of peoples across the world, across the globe. Our hope is that people really recognize that there's a symbiotic relationship between the economic, social, and political spheres of our world, right? And we also define interdependence as 2 or more countries relying on and impacting each other. And I think when we think about the different kind of either economic, political, or social, or even cultural spheres of society, we recognize increasingly that the 21st century is defined by interdependence, despite maybe some of the political rhetoric that exists in the United States of being, or in other countries in the world, of kind of like the retreating of some of those alliances or some of that interdependence that has existed historically over the 20th century and now the 21st century. So what are the different forms of interdependence? There's economic, environmental, social, and political interdependence. Right. So if we think about South America and their interdependence as it relates to the Amazon, Amazon spans, in an environmental sense, spans multiple countries, right? Or when we think about water, and especially here in the Rio Grande Valley, we have water rights issues that take place here. So we have some environmental issues that are also interconnected to economic and political. And we also need to understand that power dynamics are at play, especially when we talk about cultural, social, economic, political, or environmental globalization and interdependence, that inherently in this paradigm that we have existing today, that there are power dynamics, as the United States is one of the largest global superpowers in many ways, right? And so we define power, as we're talking about this, as the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others, the ability to exercise control over others. And you're going to notice that in today's conversation in a different geopolitical. Today we have conflict and connections, the US and Central America in the 21st century. We're very excited to bring back Dr. Pamela Neumann, who's an assistant professor of sociology. It's been about 3 years, I think, since the last time you were here with us. I think it's about 3 years. And so it's interesting to always take a look here. So let's give her a warm dust of a welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hudson, for that introduction. Um, how many of you have taken a class on Latin American history, politics, or culture during your time at TAMU? Okay. So for some of you, some of what I say might be familiar, but I am going to talk a little bit about some historical dynamics in Latin America and specifically Central America as part of my talk that might ring some bells for you, right? But before I talk about the content of my talk, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. And I want to tell you what my experience and what my connection is, since we're talking about interconnection and globalization. I want to tell you about my connection to Central America. So long before I became a professor, long before I became a graduate student, I worked for a non-governmental organization or an NGO in Nicaragua for 3 years between 2006 and 2009. And it was during that time that I became very well acquainted with the long history and interdependence and power dynamics between the US and Central America. And I became fascinated by this history and the experiences of everyday people and what they had lived through, and especially the situation of women and girls in Nicaragua and in Central America more broadly. And that is what eventually led me to come back to the United States, pursue a master's degree in Latin American studies, during which time I went back to Nicaragua and I did research in a rural village, looking at women's roles in community development, kind of building on my interest in NGOs and development work. And that led me to pursue my PhD in sociology, where I continued to study issues related to gender-based violence and laws that were intended to protect women. And so that is my background, that is my connection to Central America. So even though I was born in the United States and my first language is English, I have a strong and deep connection to Central America. I am fully bilingual in Spanish. I really immersed myself during the time that I lived there. And throughout the time that I have been a professor and academic, I can continue to focus my research on Central America. And so this has really been the professional focus of my career since finishing graduate school. Okay, so I wanted to set that background so that you know where I'm coming from, right? What my standpoint is on these issues. So I think many of us are familiar with some of these images that I am showing on the screen right now, right? When we think about Central America, the first thing that probably comes to most of our minds is the massive wave of migration that has been coming to the southern border of the United States, right? Since President Obama and really long before, right? But these images and others like them have really captured the political and social and economic attention of our country, because there's a lot of concerns about the impact of a massive wave of migrants, specifically from Central America, because of a lot of the predominant stereotypes and ideas that people have about what these countries are like, right? And I want to use my talk today to try to explain, to give some broader context for what is behind these images, right? What is the historical, the social, the economic context that puts these pictures in their rightful position, right? This is not the whole story. This is a particular image and representation of Central America that is incomplete, and it does not fully reflect the role of the United States, right? Speaking of globalization and interdependence, it does not reflect or help us to understand what the US has to do with all of this. Because often when we think about immigration, what we're thinking about is just, why are people coming here from other places, right? We aren't thinking about what is the United States doing to potentially draw or encourage people to come here in the first place, okay? So to help us better understand that broader context and how we got to where we are today, I want to give some historical context. I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that happened in Central America during the Cold War. I'm going to talk about the democratization process and what scholars call neoliberalism, or the economic systems that have influenced Central America's economies. I'm going to talk about issues related to poverty and violence and insecurity and how those have influenced ordinary people's experiences living in Central America. And then I'm going to talk about some more contemporary examples of US foreign policy and how it's impacted Central America, thinking about foreign aid as well as specific examples of immigration policy, which that could be a whole talk in itself. So there's no possible way I can talk about all of the immigration policies that have impacted Central America, but I'll talk about a few. And then I also want to emphasize the contributions that Central American people have made to the United States, because there are many. And there are very important contributions, which I'll get to later in my talk. And then I'm going to end by asking a question that maybe we don't know the answer to right now, because as we all know, there is a presidential election in less than 1 week. And the answer to the question of what's going to happen to the relationship between the US and Central America in the 21st century may depend quite a bit on the outcome of this election. Okay, so with that said, let me jump in. All right, so for those of you who have had some Latin American politics, some Latin American history, some of this will be familiar, right? But to understand the 21st century, we have to go back. We have to understand the historical roots of contemporary problems, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. And so we have to go back and remember that throughout most of the second half of the 20th century, we were living through the Cold War. There was a geopolitical battle between East and West. There was the ever-present threat of communism posed by Russia. That was the dominant perception at that time. And there was a US foreign policy approach that any encroachment of socialist or communist ideas into the Western Hemisphere was a danger and a threat that needed to be actively combated. And so as Central American countries, and really countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, began to realize that they no longer wanted to be ruled by corrupt elites or by dictators, they started to rebel. There started to be elections of leaders that had different ideas, different policy proposals, more leftist-leaning ideas in some cases. And these leftist leaders in many countries in Latin America were seen as a threat to the geopolitical control that the United States had over Latin America and had maintained for most of the 1900s and even before that. And so there's many examples of this. One example is in 1954, when Guatemala elected a man named Jacobo Arbenz, who was perceived as a threat, not only to US political interests, but also to US economic interests, because there were US corporations that had quite a bit of economic power and owned quite a bit of land in Guatemala. And as a result of that, this leader, Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown in a coup. And the resulting turmoil that sort of sprang up as a result from that, there was the 30-year civil war in Guatemala, including the genocide of indigenous Maya people. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, many more were displaced. And a similar situation occurred in El Salvador, where there was also a leftist uprising by the FMLN, the Faribundo Martí Liberation Movement, where they were trying to promote more socialist ideas about the distribution of wealth, about political power, and these ideas were seen as threatening. And so there was an effort to squash that movement. The US government was actively funding and supporting the right-wing governments that were trying to squash these left-wing movements in both of these countries. And the same thing was true in Nicaragua. Although in Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution managed to triumph, it managed to overcome quite a bit of US support and opposition. But then as soon as they won under the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan, the US funded an opposition force to try to take down the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. And that did not end until 1990. So why does all of this matter? You're thinking, is she expecting me to answer the question? No, I just needed a water break. The answer is that this matters because political violence doesn't just stop affecting a society the second it's over. Just because there's suddenly people putting down their weapons and there's a peace accord and a peace process doesn't mean that people's lives aren't affected in ongoing ways, and their perceptions of their leaders, their perceptions of authorities, the distribution of social, political, and economic power, none of those things change overnight, right? And so as these countries came out of these long, enduring civil wars, the amount of insecurity, the amount of mistrust, the amount of military power and influence and economic power and influence, none of those things were going to be changed overnight, right? And people's distrust of one another and the way that the social fabric had been torn apart because there were people in the same communities who were on different sides in all of these conflicts, right? People in the same families. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And so as these countries tried to rebuild themselves through the creation and the development of democratic institutions, there were a lot of obstacles in the way of doing that. And there was the added burden of having to actually rebuild these countries economically. And so in many cases, what happened is that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are two large lending agencies, they offered quite a bit of financing and loans to Central American countries to help them rebuild their nations. But those funds came with strings attached for the ways that the government could be active in the economy, the amount of regulation there could be in certain sectors of the economy, which industries the government could be in control of and which industries needed to be privatized. There was a lot of emphasis on deregulation and on free trade, which continues to be an ongoing theme in Central America and throughout the region. And so what happened is you have a situation where these countries are trying to establish democracy in a political sense, suddenly people having the right to vote, trying to create fair institutions to give people access to legal justice, while at the same time not addressing the fundamental economic inequalities and insecurities and divisions that had provoked the social conflicts in the first place, that had led to these civil wars, right? Because the fundamental underlying dynamic provoking these civil wars is that wealth and power in many Central American countries, like lots of Latin America, was in the hands of a very small number of elites, right? And these civil wars were an attempt to change that. But during the democratization process, none of that fundamentally changed. Elites still had most of the power, and the distribution of resources in these countries did not change. So what is it like to try to live in a democracy where you have political rights, but no economic opportunity? That is a recipe for crime, violence, insecurity, and that's exactly what happened. And the reaction of Latin American governments, Central American governments, was something called mano dura. How many have heard of mano dura before? It's kind of this iron-fisted approach to crime and insecurity, which means kind of like we had this period of three strikes laws in the United States, for drug crimes and things like that. This, on steroids, right? Imprisoning people, locking people up for, very small crimes, really targeting gang members, thinking that people were going to address violence by locking people up. This was the theory, right? All you have to do is put people in jail and the crime and the violence will stop. Well, that's not what happened. And the fundamental economic reality did not shift. And even in the early part of the 2000s into the 21st century, it did not shift because there was an ongoing emphasis on free trade, on opening markets, on allowing corporations to import their products into Central America, making it harder for Central American businesses and companies to compete with their US counterparts who are often much bigger, right? So they could offer lower prices, right? So it put a lot of people either out of business or made it just harder to make a living, right? Selling the things that they had been traditionally selling. And the emphasis on mano dura was reinforced after 9/11. Many of you were not probably alive when 9/11 happened, or you're very young, you don't remember it. But this is really when the war on terror, as it was known, began. After the attacks on the Twin Towers in 2001, there was, quite a lot of emphasis on security and securitization, right? The most important thing is national security and figure out all these new ways to put up barriers to make it harder for people to come into the United States, and also a lot more interest in the drug trade and how it was sort of moving through Central America and how can we stop that, because we thought, our government in the United States thought if we, control the drug trade, maybe we can also reduce violence and insecurity. But the emphasis on counter narcotics and on national security and all of these things, again, did not fundamentally change the underlying economic situation that not only provokes migration, but leads people to engage in all kinds of crime, right? To try to improve their situation. Okay, so that's a little bit of historical background. So what is all of that meant to show you? It's meant to show you that since the 1990s, when those civil wars ended in most of Central America, what has been the dominant approach to improving Central America? It's been to combat drugs, to put people in jail, but never to address the fundamental social and economic issues facing these countries. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking on now. So Central American countries, as you may or may not know, have economies that are based primarily on agricultural products, bananas, cotton, sugar, coffee, and to a lesser extent now textiles because of maquiladoras, which have come in. You are all probably familiar with maquiladoras in Mexico, but they also exist in Central America. And there's been some increasing industry, light industry, like medical equipment and things like that. But certainly not enough to fundamentally change the economic structure of these societies in which the vast majority of people are poor or extremely poor and working in the informal economy, which is just a fancy term for people who don't have a 40-hour-a-week job with benefits and a guaranteed salary, right? Most people do not know where their next meal is coming from. And on top of that, there's still a substantial rural population in many of these countries. And that land ownership is extremely unequal, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador. And I put the specific statistics there for you so you can see just how unequal it is. Where about 1% of the population owns more than half the land in all of Guatemala. And just under 10% of the population owns almost 3/4 of the land in El Salvador. So what is the impact of that? It means that many, many people do not have access to the most fundamental resource that is used to generate wealth. And we know this instinctively in the United States because what is the dream of every person once, they get to be an adult? Well, to get a college degree first, right? And then second, to own a home, right? And why is that so important? Because owning a home is the most important asset for generating wealth. And it's the same thing everywhere in the world. Owning land, owning a house, these are the ways that people build equity, they build wealth. And in a rural community, owning land is also your means of subsistence. It's your means of feeding your family, right? If this is how you make your living, this is also how you feed your family. And so if you don't have the ability to do that, you are at the mercy of the people who own the land to decide how much they're going to pay you to work on their land, to produce these crops. And so that enables a massive amount of exploitation and the ongoing concentration of power. Okay, so not surprisingly, these dynamics have contributed to, I'm not going to say cause because I am a sociologist and I don't believe in direct causality about pretty much anything. There's always too many factors to say any one thing caused anything else. But we can say that there is a relationship, there is a correlation between these extreme economic inequities and violence and homicide rates in particular in Central America. And I've given you some data here that shows historical trends over time. So we can see, for example, that there's kind of a peak between 2014 and kind of spikes, around 2015, 2016, and then starts to go down. I'm going to talk in a minute about some political factors that are also, I think, correlated with this. And so that's the data for El Salvador. And there's a similar pattern with a slightly different curve for Honduras. And then I've given you a way of comparing that data for other countries other than Central America. You can see, how dangerous it is to live in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador in particular. But these homicide rates don't occur in isolation. They are connected to broader political dynamics that are happening in these countries. And there's so much to say about these political dynamics. This could also be like a whole separate talk. But what we have seen in the last decade in Central America is extreme efforts to consolidate power on the part of particular political leaders, authoritarian maneuvering. So Daniel Ortega, for example, in Nicaragua has been in power since 2006. It's now 2024. So do the math. How many years is that? 18. Then we have leaders like Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, who was initially elected in 2014, and then got the rules of the game changed to enable his own reelection. And then later, after he finally lost, was extradited to the United States to face trial for his participation in drug trafficking. And then, you know, the newest, the most popular strongman in Latin America now, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, has gotten a lot of attention because of his efforts to basically throw due process out the window to address the problem of the maras and the gangs in El Salvador. There's now between 70 and 80,000 people in jail. Most of them have never had a trial. They're there because somebody reported them, or they're suspected because they have a tattoo, right? So throwing out the rule of law in an effort to address issues related to crime and insecurity. And the same thing is true in Guatemala. Guatemala's previous president tried to basically sabotage the current president, President Arevalos' ability to even take power. And it's a miracle. It's an uprising of the people that enabled that not to happen. So there's been an effort to weaken institutions, to circumvent the rule of law, right? That has made the political climate very unstable. People feel that their government is not responsive to their needs, to their concerns. And so it's not surprising that they're finding their own ways to solve problems themselves, right? All right. But all of this sort of move toward authoritarianism and efforts to rely on law enforcement, the police, the military to kind of crack down on crime is not occurring in a vacuum, right? US policy, there's still a continuation of the old Cold War logics that are still with us, okay? So for example, in 2009, there was a military coup in Honduras. How many of you remember that? Anybody remember the military coup in 2009 in Honduras? Okay. When that happened, it was against a left-leaning political leader, Mel Zelaya, in Honduras. The military decided they did not like the direction that his policies were going, and that's a whole long story. But when the military took over, what did the US do? It equivocated. It basically said, well, we're not sure it's a coup or not. We don't really know. It did not take a strong stand for the right of this leftist leader to remain in power, who was forcibly removed and actually literally put on a plane and forced to leave the country. Okay. And the US is signaling that this was basically fine, right? Sent a message to the rest of the region, right? Because the US still has quite a lot of geopolitical influence throughout the region. Okay. The second thing is all of our foreign aid, all the money that our government is sending to Central America, there's been a number of different names for all of these policies that have been used. But one of the most well-known is the Central American Regional Security Initiative. And this is an initiative where basically the main focus is on funding police training or funding counter-narcotics operations, right? So most of the focus of our foreign aid is on security. It's related to drugs, it's related to gangs and crime, and attempts to strengthen democratic institutions and legal processes, et cetera, right? But what's interesting is that we have laws here in the United States that actually are paradoxically undermining our own efforts to combat violence in Central America. And one of the most important of those areas is our gun laws in the United States. So you might think, what in the world do gun laws in the United States have to do with violence in Central America? Well, it turns out quite a lot, because there is a huge industry of people, not just smuggling, but legally getting weapons from the United States into Central American countries. And those weapons end up in the hands of people who then commit homicides or other kinds of crimes. And it's not just the maras or the gangs that are getting their hands on these weapons. It's lots of ordinary, everyday people that also have access to these weapons. And so I just gave you one stat there, to show you the extent of this problem, right? So here we are blaming these societies for not getting their violence under control. But really, if we could actually limit people's access to guns, that would probably alleviate quite a bit of the violence, because guns are in fact lethal weapons. Okay, I also gave you some data here on the side to kind of show you, the amount of money. That text is a little bit small, but it's just meant to show you that even though we are also spending some money on economic development, on more sort of health and human services kinds of programs, the vast majority of our focus for a long time has been on the security and the drug aspect of things. And what's paradoxical about our foreign policy in Central America is that we are very sort of selectively friendly with undemocratic leaders, right? So, for example, there's Barack Obama with Porfirio Lobo, who was the guy that was appointed president, basically. Well, I mean, he was elected, but anyway, but following the coup, right? And he's being warmly welcomed to the White House by President Obama. And then we have, the newest aspiring authoritarian in El Salvador, Bukele, being warmly welcomed by President Trump to the White House as well. So this is just meant to give you some illustrations that even though the United States has a discourse around the importance of democracy, what really winds up happening is that we are very selective in our alliances. And we also are fine with working with authoritarians or dictators or leaders who serve our own geopolitical interests as the United States. Okay, that is the point I'm trying to get across here. All right. We also have some specific immigration-related policies that impact Central Americans who decide to come here. Given all of these realities that are going on in their countries, it's perhaps not surprising to you now that many of them are leaving, right? They've had enough. Well, to deal with migration from Central America, there's two main policies. There's many others, but I don't have time to talk about all of them. But there's two main policies that are impacting quite a lot of Central American migrants. The first is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is a prosecutorial discretion executive order that was initiated by President Obama back in 2012, essentially providing temporary protection to young people brought to the United States as children, right, from other countries. This doesn't just affect Central Americans, it affects many other immigrants as well who are brought here as children. But I wanted to point out that there's over 50,000 Central American youths and young adults who have acquired DACA status since the program was initiated. However, since 2021, no new applications are being processed because this executive order was challenged in court. And there is an appeals court, I believe here in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, who decided it was unconstitutional, but allowed, people currently protected to stay protected, and they can renew their DACA status. It has to be done every year. You have to renew your DACA status every year to maintain those limited protections. So it's not a permanent solution by any means. Every year you have to reapply to be able to still work or attend school, et cetera, right? But there's been, because this program has been in action now for a decade, there's now research on what kind of impact this program has had on Central Americans and on recipients in general who have benefited from this policy. And I can give you exact data if you're interested from the American Immigration Council, but the bottom line is that people who applied for DACA status and were able to benefit from those opportunities, they are making substantially greater educational and economic contributions to the United States. They have bought cars, they have bought houses, they have joined professions where we lack, where we have a labor shortage in the United States because there aren't enough people who are US citizens who want those jobs. So these individuals have made a positive contribution to our country through this program. And then the second main immigration-related policy that I want to briefly discuss is this temporary protected status, which again is also not a permanent policy. It's a temporary status that has to be renewed by the government. It's kind of like an emergency status that is given to people who have to leave their countries of origin under exceptionally difficult circumstances, such as a natural disaster. And that is how many people in Central America actually originally acquired the status, is because there was a devastating hurricane back in the late 1990s, Hurricane Mitch, which destroyed most of Central America. And it was during that time, under the Clinton administration, that this temporary protected status was granted to many Salvadorans as well as Hondurans who needed someplace to go, right? Their communities were destroyed. So these are two programs, two policies that have really impacted the lives of many Central American migrants. But I want you to notice something about those. Both of them are temporary. Neither of them are long-term guarantees of economic or political or civil rights of any kind, right? And so you can imagine the impact that could potentially have on the lives of Central Americans who are living in constant uncertainty that at any time the rug could be pulled out from under them and suddenly they will no longer have temporary protected status. Suddenly, they may no longer have DACA status. And when that happens, they could be deported at any time. Meanwhile, we're talking about people who have been in the United States for years, if not decades, some of whom have children who are US citizens because they were born here. And so you have to imagine, right, the potential psychological and social impacts of having a group of people in your society who are trying to put down roots, who are trying to positively contribute to society, but are faced with this legal limbo, or what a prominent sociologist, Cecilia Menjivar, who is Salvadoran herself, calls liminal legality, right? This sort of in-between space where you don't know if you really have legal protection or not. Okay. But despite all this, Central Americans are a very important part of US society, even though we're only accustomed to seeing them as victims of natural disasters, of crime, of violence, of hardship. All of those things are true. However, they are part of thriving communities in many different parts of our country, including right here in Texas, in Houston, in Dallas, especially in Los Angeles and other parts of California, on the East Coast. And you can see there how the population of Central American immigrants has increased over time. It's quite substantial, 3.8 million Central American immigrants of Central American origin in the United States. And how did they get here? Even though all the discourse is about the folks who are coming to the border seeking legal status, seeking asylum, right? The vast majority of people from Central America who come here don't come that way. They actually come through immediate relatives who file petitions to bring their family members here through legal pathways, family-sponsored preferences, and in some cases through employer-based visas. A much smaller percentage come here specifically through refugee or asylum-seeking processes. And you can see there the exact numbers, right? And I also put a stat up here about, because you're probably wondering, well, how many of them are undocumented? Well, there you go. There's 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, and Central Americans are about 19-20% of them. So that means they are how many? Who's good at math? 20% of 10 million? 2 million? Okay, so, even though the discourse is about all these undocumented immigrants, the vast majority of Central Americans who are coming here legally and who are staying here legally. And they're doing a lot of important things for our country. They're contributing in a lot of very constructive ways to our social and our economic life. So for example, on the top left there, I've put some data on the employed workers in our civilian labor force as of 2021. So you can see for all immigrants, the light blue is Central American immigrants and US born, the different industries that they're in. So there are Central American immigrants doing jobs in all of these fields: management, business, science, service, sales and occupations, natural resources, transportation. But you should notice where they're concentrated: service occupations, construction, which is probably not surprising to many of us, right? These are jobs that immigrants are taking, Central American immigrants and other groups are taking because US citizens do not want those jobs. It is a complete misconception that Central American immigrants are taking anyone's jobs. The US economy produces hundreds of thousands of jobs every month, every 2 months. And people are needed to fill those jobs. In fact, I just heard a podcast on Planet Money, which is a great economics-oriented podcast, about how the tightness of the US labor market actually makes it imperative that we need immigrants from all places, including Central America, because there are so many jobs and not enough people to take them all. So that is one thing. Another way that Central American immigrants have contributed to the United States is through their advocacy for social justice and for labor rights and protections. And this goes all the way back to the 1980s and 90s, when the first wave of Central American immigrants came to the United States in the aftermath of the civil wars, during the civil wars in these countries. They were critical, advocating for the rights of workers, in particular jobs such as janitors. And they're still doing that work. I just screenshotted a headline from April of this year in Houston, just down the road, right? Where Salvadoran janitors are fighting. They are in the streets, they are protesting, they are demanding rights for everyone else who shares that profession with them, right? They are actively contributing to a more just, more equitable environment for workers in our country. And that is very important. Like, we need people who are willing to speak up and fight for justice for other people and for themselves. And finally, Central American immigrants have been crucial to the reconstruction of communities devastated by natural disasters right here in our own country. Before I lived here, I used to live in New Orleans. Anybody been to New Orleans? How many of you remember Hurricane Katrina? Maybe some of you. Okay. Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans. Do you know who came and helped rebuild that city? Latin American immigrants, and a lot of them from Honduras specifically. And the city, in recognition of this, actually built a monument to acknowledge the contributions of these individuals. And I put a picture of that there. And the second example is Florida. After Ian, the Hurricane Ian, many communities were destroyed, and it was undocumented workers who came to help with that. And there was just recently another incident in Baltimore, right? You remember the incident in Baltimore where the bridge collapsed? Who were the workers who died? They were Central Americans. So my point is that these immigrants are not a drain on our society. They are part of the fabric of our society. We are intricately interdependent with people who are coming from other countries, who are contributing to our social and economic well-being and the political rights of marginalized groups. And for people thinking, well, maybe we should just send, I don't know, should we send less money to Central America? Like, these governments should be doing more for their own people. Well, it turns out that these same immigrants who come here and are working so hard are also sending a lot of money back to their own countries, to their countries of origins, to their families, right? Without these remittances, as they're called, the families that are still there would be even worse off than they already are. So 15% of the gross domestic product as of 2020 for Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, or greater, right? 15 to 24% was from remittances, right? It means that these immigrants from Central America who are coming here searching for a better life for whatever reason, right? They aren't just thinking about themselves. They are also thinking about their families, their friends. It suggests something about the character of these individuals, right? That they are sharing their resources and what they have, right? They have this sense of solidarity. And I think their practices, their tradition, their ways of life, their ways of coping with hardship have something to teach all of us as well. I think we can learn from them. To the theme of this series, globalization and interdependence, right? There's a long-standing assumption, that the US is the beacon of light, right, for the rest of the world, that we are the example, the shining city on a hill, that all countries aspire to be like us or to live here. Well, I think we have something to learn from people from other countries too. And I think we should have, in the United States, I'm not saying us specifically necessarily in this room, but in the United States, we should have a little more humility about what we can learn from other people, from other cultures, and what they have been through. Okay. I also want to briefly share that the dynamics of migration from Central America have been changing in recent years. So now what we are seeing is a bit less migration flow from the Central American region and more from other countries, particularly Venezuela and other parts of the world. So, and that's the result of some very recent policy changes under the Biden administration, I would say, that have led to some decreases as well as changes in the political environment in some of these countries. Okay, time for me to wrap up. What is the future of U.S. Central American relations? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know the answer to this. But I can tell you that because of the U.S.'s geopolitical power, the winner of the 2024 presidential election will have a lot of influence, a lot of power to decide what that is. And there is one candidate and one party whose primary goal is to deport. They have said this. I am not expressing a political opinion. I am stating a fact. They are on the record as stating that their policy goal is the mass deportation of immigrants. That is their goal. So if that happens, I think that will have a substantially detrimental effect, not only on Central America, but also on the United States, for all of the reasons that I have shared in this talk, for all of the many ways that Central Americans enrich our lives economically, socially, and politically. And for Central America, it will be absolutely devastating to have to incorporate millions of people who have little to no connection anymore to their countries of origin. And so I think when we make political decisions about who to vote for, we should not just be thinking about ourselves, but we should be thinking about our neighbors. And I mean our neighbors in the global sense of the word. We should be thinking like global citizens, as Dr. Hudson said at the beginning of his presentation. And so I hope in whatever our political decisions are, that we will keep that in mind. And I'll stop there. And I thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Neumann. We have time for maybe a couple of questions if we do have any. I always find this topic super interesting. So a little bit about me, to share a story and connection here. I used to work as a director of a mentor and tutoring program in Northern Virginia. And actually, if you saw the immigration patterns of where folks live from Central America, one of them is Northern Virginia. It's what the second largest concentration of Central Americans in the United States. And so I learned quite a bit as I had quite a few children in my program whose families were either recipients of TPS or who were undocumented immigrants coming from Central America, either from El Salvador, Guatemala, or Nicaragua. And so it was a very interesting, as I was 22, 23, 24, 25, learning a lot about their history and really the dynamic that existed in there. Because one of my concentrations as a history minor was also Latin American history. I didn't learn a lot to this extent at the University of Oregon about it. Nonetheless, I do think that these topics are timely, especially a week away from the election, or less than a week away. If you haven't done so already, you have 2 more days plus today to do early voting. And then on Tuesday, November 5th, you have the chance to vote here on campus at the TMU University Village. But I'm greatly appreciative of this conversation, and I think it does continue to reflect the necessity to think about ourselves in an interconnected way rather than just maybe our provincial mindset that we may have had growing up wherever we may have grown up from. So any final questions or comments? Seeing none?
Oh, I see.
sorry.
In the purple shirt.
Sorry.
So we see some of the ways that to ask, what are some of the ways that strict immigration
How could strict immigration policies negatively impact US citizens? That is a good question. And I think the answer to that has to do with that exact interconnected question, because many people who have either liminal legality, like some temporary protected status, or are undocumented, are actually connected, are part of families that include US citizens or legal permanent residents. My own family, I married a Peruvian immigrant, and I had to apply for a fiance visa, apply for legal permanent resident status, and then, to bring my stepson here, I had to go through a similar process, right? And there are millions of families like that. And so strict immigration policies don't just impact that individual undocumented person, right? It impacts their whole circle, their whole extended family, right? Which includes many people of different legal statuses. And I would say it also impacts the economy as a whole, right? So if there's a whole industry that we can't find people to work in, like home health aides or domestic workers or construction, if there are no people to do those jobs, like that is actually like a very serious problem for many communities if there's nobody to do that work.
I would kind of echo that here, Dr. Neumann. One of the things, this is just anecdotal, but a lot of the Central American families that I worked with in Northern Virginia, they were small business owners. They were creating jobs for other people in that area. And so if you are taking away that economic benefit for an area, because they do pay taxes, they do have own property, right, of that area, that funding that's available for like water or sewer or school districts, whatever it may be, is being removed from the economy. And that would be an absolute jolt for the American economy. There's no more soft landing, as was just described today, with the 2.8 GDP growth for the last quarter. You're going to see a pretty substantial economic shift. And really, it's a paradigm shift, right? Like if you think about it, it's a huge paradigm shift from the way it currently exists today.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Excellent.
All right.
And thank you for the question. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Oh, in the back.
What would be your ideal immigration policy?
Oh boy, that's a dangerous question. Dr. Hunt is like, let me step away.
Sociologist answer that one.
All right. I'm going to answer this partly as a sociologist and partly as a person. I think the best solution is to have legal pathways to permanent status of some kind that are efficient enough that people will choose those rather than what seems like the more expedient, quote unquote, illegal way of pursuing, residence in the United States. I think if those pathways were more available to people, more people would choose them. And if it didn't take, just to give a personal example, it took 3 years to bring my stepson here legally. He was 8 when we started, and he's going to be 12 next week. So, and that's not even anything. Like some people wait decades, right? And so if your life is at stake, you don't have decades to wait. But if you know that there's a process you could undergo, and maybe in a year or 2 years, there's going to be an answer, right? Okay, maybe I'm willing to go through that, right? Versus risking my life to come through the Darien Gap instead, yeah. Thank you for that question. reasonable people can disagree with what the right immigration policy is. I just gave my opinion.
I think that it's also inherent within that conversation when we talked about the beginning point of this conversation is that we are interconnected and we are interdependent with each other, right? And so when we think about the right immigration policy, like we have to understand that human throughout all of our society history, we have immigrated from one area to another, right? It is a natural cycle. And especially as we begin to see climate catastrophes, or especially as we see kind of some of the authoritarianism that's taking hold and root, as we saw here in some of these political governments, inherently, you're going to try to find different things. Same thing happened in South America in the 1980s with Operation Condor that took place down there in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, right? Like people immigrated from there to avoid what was going on. So I think inevitably a policy has to be in place. I don't know what that is, but it has to be in place to acknowledge that human beings have historically immigrated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really appreciate, we really appreciate, there is a class that takes place here at 4:30. So I need to be mindful. I need to get all these people fed as well. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming.
Yes.
I'm happy to discuss outside the room.
Before you leave though, I do need you all to fill out this survey. That's how you get food. Hey, we learned our lesson. Fill out the survey. And I am going to end our recording.